Um, through multiple literacies and learning styles, Adam's primary research interests includes modern US history, African-American experiences, race, gender, social movements, and urban history. He has presented his research as a special guest lecturer at public and private universities and at major academic conferences in the US. Adams has received several state foundation and institutional fellowships and scholarships, including the Black Metropolis Research Consortium Summer Short-Term Fellowship Program funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and the King V. Hostick Scholarship funded by the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum and the Illinois State Historical Society. Adams graduated from Chicago State University with a BA in History and African American Studies, as well as an MA in History specializing in Africa and the Cold War and US labor movements. He is an active member of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, where he served as the Chicago branch's secretary and vice president. And I should also mention that William and I have been friends for over 10 years. We first met in Chicago in the archives, also at a talk. William, you might remember this. It was with Professor John Bracey giving a talk about the classic book, Black Metropolis, which is a really classic book to study the history of Black Chicago and begin studying the history of Black Chicago from. And I remember we met at that talk and we've been friends ever since. So really thankful to have you come to UFE virtually and be able to do this in this kind of a setting. And to share your knowledge and your research with us and with especially the students of History 370. Also like to mention to everyone that we are recording the session. So you can contact me afterwards if you would like a copy of the recording if you're from outside of History 370. And I'd be happy to share it. And then we're going to have hopefully a bit of a discussion afterwards in the question and answer period after we hear from William and his exciting research. So I'll turn it over to you, William. And again, thanks again for doing this, for joining us. And please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Professor Ian Smith and University of Fraser Valley History Department and the Peace and Reconciliation Center for giving me this opportunity. Moreover, students and outside family members of the institution for giving me this opportunity. So the first thing I want to do is, and I'm going to minimize myself real quick. So this picture here are 5 wonderful individuals. From your right to your left, Nancy Jefferson, she was the leader of a grassroots organization called Midwest Community Council, which focused on mental illness, political interests of Black Chicagoans on Chicago West Side, where I'm from originally. Rebecca Sive, she was a executive at Playboy Corporation. Next to her is Reverend Willie Barrow. She was a leader for Operation Breadbasket and Rainbow Push, which, if you all don't know, is under the leadership of Jesse Jackson, Reverend Jesse Jackson. And lastly, Reverend Eddie Wyatt. She is world-renowned leader in the union movement, civil rights, and women's rights. I believe she was one of the founders of NOW, National Organization of Women. During the 60s, she was a strong advocate of the movement. So I want to illustrate why I have an interest in this research, and there are many factors in this. First of all, my family story. My mom, when I was young, my mom would tell me stories of how her experience was living in the Mississippi Delta during Jim and Jane Crow. But there was also a local curiosity, historical curiosity. So I remember when I was I say 8, 9 years old. I was playing baseball at a local park, I'll call it Lafayette Park. And I looked up at this pole and I see this Italian American running for public office in my ward. And I was looking around saying, where are all the white people? How's this guy running for office? And there's no white people in my ward. Now I grew up in a black upper middle class community, and there's very how may I put it? It was not that many white people in my community. And a third thing that I noticed growing up, when I would visit my uncle who lived close to downtown, and I would take public transportation. Now I grew up close to the border of the suburbs called Oak Park, and I would take either the train or the bus. And every time when I get close to his house, I noticed that there were buildings that were dilapidated. There was vacant lots, and I was always interested in, well, why does this area look the way it does? And I would talk to people, and people would say, well, Black people tore their communities up. They burned down their communities. And I thought it was much more bigger than that. And what really caught my interest was the uprising in 1968 after the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And I came to realize, well, this was a resistance movement against the local government in Chicago. And after doing more research, I realized that Chicago was a paradox in the experience for Black Chicagoans. The city was indicative of this binary. The city of Chicago is an important geographic region with respect to the influence of African Americans and people in the United States and globally. Through the impact on culture, through various institutions, you had the DuSable Museum of African American Museum of African American History, which Ian Books brilliantly articulates. You had the Chicago Renaissance from 1930 to 1953, which I'm going to briefly talk about that later on in my presentation, and the Black Power movement that transpired during the mid-60s to mid-70s. More, you had Black media, Chicago Defender, Jet, and Ebony magazine. But particularly politicians. We can debate that Chicago set the standard when it came to the development of the most recognized and powerful African-American politicians. For example, you had Oscar the Priest, who in 1928 became the first African-American to be a member of the U.S. Congress since U.S. Reconstructions. You had Arthur Mitchum, the first African-American to be elected U.S. Congress in the Democratic Party. And later on in the 20th century, you had Clara Mosley Braun, who was elected as the first African-American woman senator in 1992. And Jesse Jackson, who ran for office in 1984 and 1988 for the presidency of the United States. Well, I also would like to point out that President Obama came to Chicago because of the election of Harold Washington. Well, at the same time, like I said, there was this American apartheid system, which you had school segregation, decayed and insufficient schools in Black communities, employment, housing discrimination, the lack of public service. The one thing I can think about is my former congressman, Danny Davis. And Danny Davis saying that he was so more focused on getting the city to pick up garbage in the community instead of implementing policies, that he was given the nickname Garbage Alderman. But lastly, I want to point out Richard J. Daley. Okay. Probably the most powerful mayor in the United States during his time. Chairman of the Democratic Party in 1953, mayor of Chicago from 1955 until his death in 1976. And he also was the chairman of the Democratic Central Committee. He also had the nickname Boss, Pharaoh. Now, Daley was pretty much, he was the closest thing to being a dictator if you want to think about dictatorship in the United States. So he was known as one of the last political bosses. The irony of Daley is, well, he was elected because of Black Chicagoans in 1955. But upon his election, he gained insurmountable control of not only Chicago politics, but county-wise, Cook County, and also statewide. So if there were state senators or state representatives that was in the process of passing a law or a bill, but Daley would say, I don't want you to vote for this bill or kill this bill, they would do it because there were consequences. So my research illustrates Black women in Chicago in their activism during this time period, 1955 to 1987. The last thing that really caught my attention was this professor, and he was an activist, Robert Starks, who teaches at Northeastern Illinois University, political science. He said something that was very profound. He said that, well, it was for Black women, Harold Washington would never been elected as mayor of Chicago. Moreover, there would not be a movement without Black women. So I was like, aha. So that's why I focus on this subject matter. So my purpose is to integrate the topic of Black women's leadership in various movements in Chicago. I want to highlight the idea that Black women were the linchpin of Black Chicagoans' resistance against the Cook County Democratic machine, and also probe into the subject of what is activism. So normally when we think about activism in the 20th century, we always think about protests, we think about demonstration, we think about sit-ins. But activism can be being a good mother, refuting this mythology that, well, Black women were bad parents, they were hypersexual, they were not capable of being in leadership positions. But these women that I have researched prove that was not the point. So in this presentation, I outlined several things I'm going to focus on. Black women influence on Harold Washington intellectual growth as a youth. Harold Washington campaign, prior to him running for mayor in 1983, Washington's run for mayor in 1983, and women activism in reform and public service after Washington's campaign. So this beautiful complex is George Cleveland Hall Library. It was opened up in January 13, 1932 in the area called Bronzeville. It's located in Chicago's South Side. So my best description of this area is, if you're familiar with Harlem in New York, or if you're familiar with Roxbury in Boston, those are similar areas. You can describe what this region is segregated, and it was done by design to keep Blacks from moving out of this area and expanding to white ethnic communities. So a couple of things here. This complex was a major, it was the epicenter for the Harlem Renaissance. Not the Harlem Renaissance, I'm sorry, the Black Chicago Renaissance from the 1930s to like the 1950s. And you had individuals who were fellowship in this complex, such as you had Lorraine Hansberry, you had Richard Wright, you had Gwendolyn Brooks, who also was there learning, and they were very influential to renowned Black scholars such as Gwendolyn Brooks. You had Dr. Margaret Burrow, and also Harold Washington. So the library was under the leadership of mainly women, particularly Vivian Harsh, G. Harsh, and Charlemagne Rollins. So Vivian Harsh was the head librarian at this library, which was the first library that was invested in African American communities, by the way, in Chicago. So Vivian would go around the country and gather books that's relevant to the Black experience in the United States. And Charlemagne Rollins was the children's library who would guide the children that visited the library to various books that students were, they had interest in. They were intrigued about. So among these children was Harold Washington. And in a quote by his high school friend, Dempsey Travis, he illustrates his fascination, his love for these women. He stated that there was another lady I was very fond of, Miss Charlemagne Rollins, a librarian at George Cleveland Hall Library, which is located at 4801 South Michigan Avenue, 2 blocks from DuSable High School and 4 blocks from my home. I read through whole section of this library. Ms. Vivian Harsh, the head librarian at the George Cleveland Hall branch, was instrumental in pulling together the most comprehensive collection of books on African American history in Chicago. It was in that collection that I was first exposed to Black authors such as Carter G. Woodson, Dr. W.B. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington. Now, Harold Washington eventually became a very influential leader in not only the community, in the Black community, but for the state. He cut his teeth in politics with his father. His father groomed him into politics, and Harold Washington melded his intellectual thought, where he learned from the library. Harold Washington was a prolific speaker. He was a walking thesaurus. He would make his candidates dumbfounded every time he talked, particularly in debates. So as Harold Washington started to have his political career, women played a major role in his career. Now he did start politics prior to 1977, but he decided to run in a special election runoff for Chicago mayor because of death. He passed away. He had a heart attack in an examination. He visited his physician in 1976 of December. He had a heart attack, massive heart attack. He died. So this left the mayor's seat open. So he decided to run. So women, they became active in his campaign. So, and also he also ran for U.S. Congress, and I'm going to talk about that later on. So these women participated in search committee for a Black mayor. So they were looking at not only Harold Washington, but other other Black politicians to challenge the seat, even prior to 1977. This committee has been was ongoing since I would say 1968. They campaigned for Harold Washington. They organized, they recruit, they were surrogates, and they strategize. They one individual I know, Reverend Eddie Wyatt, who I mentioned prior, was a strong supporter of Harold Washington. She would note excellent things that Harold Washington would do on behalf of women. And I interviewed a woman named Bernita Howell Berry. I don't have a picture of her, unfortunately. And she was the vice chairman and chief's scheduled for Washington's campaign. And she mentioned that she was like a Swiss Army knife. That she was like the jack of all trades. She would do everything to help Harold Washington, to help his campaign. Unfortunately, his campaign was short. He was not able to win the seat because of funding, because of the lack of support from Black politicians, because of the fear of the Democratic machine. And perhaps later, after my presentation, I can talk more about the significance of the Democratic machine. So the thing about these women activity, it was in preparation for his run for office in 1983. And it was a very interesting time, because he was trying to decide what to do in 1982. People was encouraging him to run for office. Now, prior to him running again, he was reelected as a state senator in the 26th district, which was Chicago South Side. They launched a campaign for him to be a U.S. representative in the 2nd district, a U.S. congressman, which he won. And as I mentioned before, it provided him experience for the preparation when he ran for mayor again. So this is a poster when Harold Washington was running for office, state senator in Illinois. So I'm not sure you're able to see this. And Ian, I can send you this. I can send you this if anyone's interested in looking closely at it. So just a couple of things I want to point out. The names at the bottom, I have an arrow pointed to Nancy Jefferson, and down and below that is Eddie Wyatt. So these are the same women that were shown in the early in the PowerPoint slide. And this is not going to be the last time you see these women. So as 83, the election was coming, Chicago elected its first woman as mayor of Chicago, Mayor Jane Byrne. She was a Democrat. She was articulating in her campaign for change, for reform. But when she got elected with the help of Black Chicagoans, it was business as usual for the Democratic machine. Now, these 4 boxes illustrate 4 events that transpire that helped spur Washington's decision to run for mayor of Chicago again in 1983. Chicago Housing Authority, there was an issue with women were being raped in Chicago Housing Authority complexes. These were housing projects, which had a large, mostly African-American population. And the women in these complexes demanded protection from the city, but the city was very, very slow in responding to the demand. And there was one event which the women at CHA went to City Hall, and they were very, how may I put it? They were pretty much in the face of law enforcement, and it caused a mass arrest of Black women. And the impact of this caused a boycott called Chicago Fest, which is now called Taste of Chicago. And in this boycott, they asked Black entertainers to boycott performing there. They asked Stevie, I know younger generation may not know Stevie Wonder. They asked the other group, it's on the tip of my tongue right now, Kool and the Gang, to ask them to boycott the Chicago Fest. And I think Stevie Wonder boycott Chicago Fest, but I think Kool and the Gang, they did not boycott, but they wore bands and sign up in showing of solidarity for the boycott. And there was a lack of resources for Black and brown communities. There was a lack of representation. It goes back to where I grew up at. There, you had a predominantly Black community, but you had an Italian American representing that community, and this is because of gerrymandering. One quote I remember was Alderman named Zulu. He made an interesting quote of the growing Mexican community in his ward. He said that, quote, there may be a Mexican alderman, but he's gonna be my Mexican alderman, quote unquote. And there was also a growing apprehension and resistance towards Reagan policy against women. Reagan was advocate of cutting social programs in the United States. So, and I can delve more into that if you want me to, doing Q&A. Now, when Harold was on the verge of running for office, the women worked in various offices during this time period. They was reaching out to people, everyday people, the common people. There was a push of the voting registration. Women from different social classes, education, occupation were lobbying and supporting Harold Washington, and women from various geographical areas. And there was individuals and groups. To your right, there's a poem that was written by a high school student from Lane Tech High School, who wrote a poem of how she felt about Harold Washington. Now, this poem was based on Lift Every Voice and Sing jingle, but I'm not going to sing it to you. So, but it illustrates this student's how may I put it? Her strong support for Harold Washington and the type of man Harold Washington was as a politician, and moreover as a fellow Chicagoan. And other people that support Harold Washington was Coretta Scott King, which she actually sent a telegram endorsing Harold Washington. And that carried a lot of weight. Now, although Harold Washington was getting all this support from individual and groups, Harold Washington was very reluctant to run for office because he felt that he got burnt when he ran in 1977, the lack of support, the lack of people not coming to vote for him. So he he brought a proposition for supporters of him. And the thing that he illustrated was he demanded he demanded 50,000 new African Americans to be registered to vote, a political war chest for $200,000 to $250,000. Now that obviously that's not a lot of money now, but you can imagine how it was in 1982, 1983 of how much is this worth, particularly on a local level. So this was significant. Despite these seemingly insurmountable demands, organizations like Chicago Black United Community, CBUC, stepped up to the challenge. A grassroots organization founded by Black activist Lou Palmer on Chicago's South Side. CBUC initiated the search for a Black candidate to run for mayor early in the 70s. Okay. So CBUC was under the leadership of a individual named Lou Palmer. Now, Lou Palmer, born in Virginia, educated in, I think he went to Syracuse. He went to a historical Black college, Virginia State University. He went to Syracuse University, and eventually he went to the University of Iowa to get his Ph.D. He never got his Ph.D., but he moved to Chicago. Now, Lou Palmer was a Black nationalist. He was a strong advocate for upward mobility for Black Chicagoans, and he was anti-machine, anti-democratic machine during this time. And Lou Palmer had a wife, and his wife's name is George Palmer, and she created the Women Auxiliary of Lou Palmer's Foundation, WALF. It was established in 1982. It was under the umbrella of CBUC. And their goal was voting registration drive and contribute to Washington's coffer. And also there was a 10 plus 10 times 10 equals victory. And I'm going to expound on that. Okay. So the auxiliary brought income to Washington's war chest through various creative ideas, like designing clothes for fashion shows, cooking meals, hosting bake sales throughout Chicago's South Side, in African-American communities. Another strategy was the idea of 10 plus 10 times 10 equals victory. This idea was supported by George Palmer, who encouraged each member to bring 10 women, whether they were co-workers, friends, relatives, and each individual would then bring $10 to donate Washington's war chest. So this idea was more of a ground up. They did not rely on corporations. So this definitely was a grassroots movement to get Harold Washington elected. And here is an example of a flyer of the 10 plus 10 times 10 equals victory. And it goes into details. It talks about the women that were involved in it, and notice who are the women that were involved in this idea. Eddie Wyatt, Willie Barrow, Nancy Jefferson, and Atisha Randolph. I didn't mention her. She was an activist in Chicago Housing Authority projects. So she was very instrumental in also the voting registration drive. Okay. And to your right, there's action for volunteers for a phone drive to get people to register to vote, and I would say for donations for a Harold Washington campaign. So this is just one of the organizations that was forged to help Harold Washington to make that decision. Well, I'm going to run for mayor now since I have this money, because they went beyond the numbers that were required. I remember that there was mixed numbers. I had numbers that estimated that they able to get $300,000. There was some that said $350,000. Registration was 100,000 Black Chicagoans to vote. So that changed Harold Washington's reluctancy to run for mayor of Chicago. There was another organization that I wanted to illustrate. Women Network for Harold Washington, established in December 1982. It was an interracial coalition. Now, this goes back to what Jacoby Williams was talking about in his book about the Black Panther Party, about this idea there was a coalition movement with Black nationalists. You had organizations, grassroots organizations in different areas of Chicago. You had the Young Lords in Lincoln Park. You had the Young Patriots in the North Side. Trying to remember the name of the area. And then you had Uprising Angrily, that was in the Logan Square area. So the founders were, I want to minimize this real quick. A. Wyatt, Reverend Willie Barrow, Nancy Jefferson, names that we have heard before. Sid Odor, he was a Jewish entrepreneur who he was very significant in bringing gospel music on television, Black gospel music and performers on television, local television. And Rebecca Sive, Rebecca Sive wanted me to just say Rebecca Sive because she don't want people to butcher her name. and Tisha Randolph, as I mentioned, activist in the CHA housing projects. And Peggy Martez, the woman that we see here on the screen. Now, the thing about Peggy Martez, her background, she is a school teacher. But she was a school teacher, rather. And she, at one point, worked in the office for Harold Washington downtown, but she got frustrated because she was being overlooked. She was not being appreciated. As a matter of fact, they did not even pay attention to her at all. I remember when I interviewed her that her office was like in a small corner of an office with a little space, and she became very upset about it. And she decided to, I'm going to help establish this organization for women, WNHW. And she was able to do this with a gentleman named, there's one gentleman named William Jennings who helped her, and he was one of the charter members of a company called Luster Products, and also Ed Gardner was Montez. He was the principal of where Montez was teaching, and as a result of that, she was able to establish an office on the south side of Chicago, on the intersection of 87 and Dobson, which is very historical because adjacent to that location is a radio station called WVON, which was one of the first radio stations. I think it's like the only Black radio station that focuses on politics to this very day. So she was able to establish this location with the help of the founders. And there's also a connection with Lou Palmer's auxiliary with WNHW, HW. They work closely together. They work hand in hand. You didn't really see this with the men because the men were griping. They were trying to decide where hair washing political headquarters is going to be located. Should it be on Chicago South Side, which is predominantly African Americans. Should be in another location on the South Side in Hyde Park, which is the University of Chicago. You had liberal whites living there, or should be downtown. In fact, they got so intense with hair washing supporters that they couldn't decide what buttons to choose for Harold Washington. Just regular buttons. But women women realized that it was much more bigger than their egos, and they worked close together. Like I said, although the auxiliary were more of a black nationalist, they worked together with the interracial coalition of WNHW. So one thing that these women did was they created a captain pyramid system to recruit 10,000 women. In the system, one woman volunteered to be captains, whose responsibility was to recruit 10 women while raising $1,000. There was another idea. The leadership position was the ward liaison, which presented all the city wards. Each representative was responsible to notify women in their respective wards about Washington's policies that dealt with women issues. Liaisons also had the job description to recruit 25 women per rally to bring in more members. And also you had the 9 plus 9 times 9 equals victory, a campaign encouraging each member to get involved by calling 9 people to vote for Washington. And right here you see is a flyer that illustrates this idea of the 9 plus 9 times 9 equals victory. It was very effective. And they also received money from Ed Gardner, and also professional athletes. Now, in Chicago, professional athletes are big, particularly American football, Chicago Bears, and you had individuals such as Walter Payton and Dick Butkus. For those who follow American football, these were Hall of Famers, inducted Hall of Famers. And also you had professional basketball players that gave money to Harold Washington campaign. Also, Playboy gave thousands of dollars to Harold Washington campaign. Hugh Hefner was a Chicagoan graduate from Steinmetz High School on Chicago North Side, and he was a strong supporter of Harold Washington. He was a strong supporter of black politicians. He's very liberal in his thinking. So all these movements played a major role in pushing Harold Washington to the finish line to be mayor of Chicago in February. There was an article that talks about the significance of African Americans. And there's an article from Milton Coleman from the Washington Post. He stated that 75% of all voting age African Americans would register for the primary on Tuesday, February 22nd, 1983. Of that group, 85% cast ballots and 80% of the group supported Washington. Overall, approximately 200,000 to 250,000 registered and voted for Washington. Most of these Chicago residents live in CHA housing. So this registration drive by women paid great dividends for Harold Washington, particularly CHA buildings, because that's a voting block itself, which daily he benefited from. Even though that these women, not only these women, but the residents in these complexes never receive the fruits of their allegiance to Daley and other politicians that were part of the Democratic machine. So when Washington was elected mayor of Chicago, he promised this idea of reform, transparency of Chicago politics. However, there was stagnant in his progress because you still had the old guards in City Hall. You still had members of the Democratic machine who did not want to give power. And one example is that is being committee members of specific committees. And there's two individuals, Ed Vdudiak and Ed Burke, both on Ed Vdudiak on the southeast side, far southeast side, which is Caucasian community. Ed Burke in the back of the yard community, back of the yard. And there was another community I can't remember at this point, but they were long time guardians of the Democratic machine. And once Harry got in Washington, he stated that it's time for a new government. We're going to change things. And Ed Vdudiak and Burke said, well, we have the votes to keep you from pushing forward your policies. So there were 29 aldermen and 21 aldermen that supported Washington. So it was this stagnant that Washington could not get his policies implemented because Vdudiak had 29 aldermen, which were all white, and Washington, who had like 4 or 5 liberal aldermen that support him, and the rest were African Americans, and it was a stagnant. And the closest thing I would say to that, if you think about President Obama during his 6 years in office, and there was a Republican Senate, and the House of Representatives was controlled by the Republican Party, and he couldn't get no policy implemented. The only thing he was able to do was pass, executive orders. And this is the same thing that Washington had to do. He had to pass executive orders because he didn't have the numbers. In spite of this, these women were not, they were not accepting this excuse. They made Harold Washington be held accountable. George Palmer, just real quick, she was a hellraiser, and she would actually call Harold Washington office and curse him out, lambast him, every opportunity for not moving fast enough. And Peggy Martez would appear at every event that Harold Washington attended. If it was opening a new facility, she was right there. If it was a parade at a specific community, she was there. And she received inside information because Harold Washington's secretary would notify her where Harold Washington was going. And like I said, she would be there every time he was there. So she was pretty much his shadow. So just real quick before I move forward, I just want to point out some things. This connections with these organizations. Okay, in '83 you had the WNHW, you had the Women Auxiliary of Lou Palmer Foundation, and also you had another organization called Chicago Citizens United under Alderman Danny Daly, which I mentioned earlier about this idea of being the garbage alderman on the west side. But these organizations were influenced by members of more established organizations. The League of Black Women, which was established in 1972. Operation Breadbasket, Operation Push, which became the Rainbow Coalition under Jesse Jackson. The National Alliance of Black Feminists, which was forged. I think this is a local chapter in Chicago. I think this is a national organization. But they played a major role in voting registration and getting women to come out to vote. And of course, CBUC, which I mentioned, and SNCC played a significant role. You had women for SNCC that were involved in Harold Washington campaign. I would also like to point out the Illinois Black Panther Party chapter, members of that. Her name is Dr. Carruthers. I can't remember her first name, but she was a member of the Black Panther Party, and she played a profound role in getting Southsiders to register to vote and to come out for the general election and the primary. So these women played a major role, and they were all affiliated with these organizations. So as I mentioned before, these women were giving Harold Washington some heat. So when Harold Washington got elected, a couple of things happened where Black women started to run for public office. The two main women I think about are Dorothy Tillman and Mary Flowers. Just real quick, Dorothy Tillman was under the tutelage of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King during his campaign in Chicago, the Chicago Freedom Movement during the mid-60s. And she decided to stay in Chicago. She's originally from Alabama. She decided to stay in Chicago. She was a resident of the CHA housing project called Robert Taylor Home, which is in Bronzeville. And she became a precinct captain, which is a major, how may I put it, was a precinct captain represented the mayor's administration. So normally, if you follow the history of Chicago, precinct captain play a major role in influencing people to vote for specific candidates. You know, there are some tales where precinct captain will say, hey, you want to vote for, let's say you want to vote for Dawson. You know, Dawson did this for you, and if you want to continue to search, it would be prudent for you to continue to vote for Dawson. Or, well, you should vote for Daley because Daley has done this for you, and if you don't vote for Daley, well, there may be a specter coming to say that your restaurant is roach infested, rat infested. So that's how sometimes this policy worked in Chicago with precinct captain. But Tillman was a major powerhouse. She, as I mentioned, she lived in the Robert Taylor Home, and she was a precinct captain. But she also facilitated a voting block in CHA housing project. You may have 2,000 to 3,000 people in CHA complex. Those are votes. And because of her, because she lobbied for Harold Washington, her activism, Harold Washington championed her and encouraged her to run for the second ward, which is on Chicago's South Side. And she won twice during a runoff in 83 and 1984. I think not 1984. I'm sorry, 1985. And always been a strong advocate for Harold Washington. And yet Mary Flowers, it's interesting that Mary Flowers, her journey was from the bottom to the top as well. She did not expect to run for office. She based on my conversation with her, she just finished undergraduate school and she was in preparation of going to law school. And Harold Washington approached her and said, you should think about running for a public office and I will support you. And one thing about Harold Washington is he had a lot of power. He had a lot of influence in the community. And Flowers, she ran for a Illinois 31st district in 1984. Now, this area is located Chicago South Side. Is I think Ian may know Inglewood, the Inglewood area. So, like I said, you're familiar. I know you're familiar with this area. So it was a South Side, which is predominantly African American. So she won that seat, and last time I checked, she still holds that seat. But another thing that happened is the executive order that Harold Washington proposed. He created, which was the creation of Women's Affairs Commission, Executive Order 84. So let me see here. Before I elaborate on it, I would like to play an audio of my interview with Janet Foreman, who's an attorney, and she was one of the legal advisors for this commission. So this is like less than 6 minutes. I'm gonna try to play like 4 minutes, if that's fine. Okay.
I don't know if I could say Black women were unique except that we're more expressive maybe in how we speak it. But we called Fast Eddie Vidoliak was Fast Eddie, and we just had nothing good to say about them. There was a constant discussion, a constant every day there was something that was scandalous about what they had done, and it was something that Bernadine Washington and on the radio and others would just talk about it. Chicago and Chicagoans are very politically tuned in and sophisticated at that time. Anyhow, we were very, very. Politics was what we talked about every day, and it was sort of like a soap opera. Every day something else would happen, and we knew what was happening in the city council. We would go down to city council, and we would actually participate in the public hearings. We would make comments. We would organize. We continued to organize, to try and get certain things passed. We would, of course, pull our sister and our white sisters into the fray as well, to pummel their aldermen and to put them on notice that they were not happy, because many of them crossed over and became pro Harold supporters even during the council war. Not as many. Most of them had to fall back, I guess, and blend into their communities. But a great deal of them did not. A great deal of them continued to be vocal Harold supporters. And so we would do rallies. I can remember doing a rally out in front of the city hall, where the Picasso statue is. Well, we were always at various for all of the ordinances that we tried to pass, particularly having to do with business. We trained young people to come and participate in the council hearings. We trained them. And oftentimes those hearings would be people all out the door, not just in the visitors gallery, but be standing around. And that was just kind of almost like every week thing. It was not something that was just for some big bill. It would be for a lot of the bills. So you got a lot of people that cut their teeth on political interfacing and being able to present at the council hearings or at the what do you call it, the committee meetings is where we were doing our various under trainings and of the young activists by having them participate in the committee hearings and make the points very well. And a lot of that was organized by women. Not everything, but of course a great deal.
I see.
We never really disbanded. You see, I mean, after the election, the women that organized around the elections just simply poured over into people that were pushing for these various ordinances that had to do with women. And so we would hold hearings and we had to do a lot of persistent pushing to get those hearings through. The big piece of legislation that we really had a hell of a time passing, but it showed you how the women really did break the power of the cabal, and that was an ordinance that had to do with the allowing home-based businesses. The unions had always opposed home-based businesses because they said that it would be potentially something that would enable sweatshops to be up in houses, and women needed it because we, of course, had micro businesses, and we needed and we could not all of our businesses could afford to jump off into spaces that we couldn't afford. So it was huge because the unions opposed it, and of course union opposition is in Chicago is the equivalent of death. You might as well just go sit down. But the women organized effort was powerful enough, was very, and it was ecumenical enough. I mean, it was white women, black women, and Asian women who every day had something major to say to their aldermen and to their media and so forth, and finally broke through and got that ordinance passed. It was major. It was major.
So it was a rainbow coalition.
It was a rainbow coalition. So, just real quick, people have the misconception that Chicago is this bastion of liberal thinking idea like you see in San Francisco. That's not true. Chicago is very conservative. They have very conservative Democrats, and these Democrats they implement conservative policies, and the union would like at the hip of these politicians. So they work really close. They work close together. So that's something I want to include. So where's the legacy? Oops, sorry. I don't know if I could say.
Sorry about that. So, as I mentioned before, January 1984, Washington passed the Executive Order 84-1, which created the Mayor Advisory Commission on Women's Affairs. The purpose of the group was to assist the mayor of developing programs, policies to help women in Chicago. So the commission consists of 33 women. Many were former members of the Women for Harold Washington. Montez became the executive director and commissioner, and Nancy Jefferson was also a member of the committee. And the impact, what was the impact? With 22% of the business contract with the city, okay? They ensured that women who were raped received medical and psychological treatment with the assistance of Chicago police, because prior to that, the women were being shamed of rape. Chicago Police Department did not take any actions when it came to the issue of rape for women. rape after Harold Washington's action. You see more. There was a department that focused on the issue of rape on women. There were rape kits that was implemented with regards to the police department. April 21st, 1986, Chicago became the first city in the country to develop a program to recruit and train women in non-traditional occupations. On May the 19th, 1986, it was the first city to create a program for women who wanted to become firefighters. The first female graduate class for the Chicago Fire Department was in 1987. Okay, so I'm gonna go back real quick and I'm come to a conclusion. When I say non-tradition, that may even being on the police force, labor occupations such as construction worker, which was viewed as a man's only occupation. But Harold Washington, who I argue was ahead of his time when it comes to his policies about women, was very progressive and make sure women would have the opportunity for employment, for make sure that they have opportunity to able to establish a business. But lastly, it's important to know that like I said, women activism was not about protest, but it was about they use various avenues to reach their agenda, to reach their goal, to make sure that there's a more fair and equal societies, particularly in Chicago, for both African Americans and women. And thank you. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, William. I'll just do like a round of applause. We can't really hear a round of applause as well on the Zoom format, but I'm sure you would be clapping really loud. So really want to thank you for that really fascinating research presentation, and lots for us to digest and lots for us to think about.
I'm sorry if I went over.
No. It's fascinating to hear, especially these local histories, because I think it's something that, especially in the students from History 370 have been, learning over the course of this semester as well, is that, movements for social change in America are often very local, very specific to the region that they centered in, right? And I was really captivated by lots of parts of your talk. Maybe I'll venture the first question here, and would invite students and anyone else in the session here to ask questions as well. And maybe you can put your name in the chat if you would like to ask a question, and then I can call on you afterwards. And then William can see it that way as well. So my question was just sort of around, you mentioned how a lot of your focus on these women activists, was also from the standpoint of looking at activism that wasn't a traditional form of activism, so thinking about like what kind of activism do the women who you studied in this project, what kind of activism do they represent as compared to sort of the better known activisms that that stand in often for public perceptions of the American Civil Rights Movement, right? Mm-hmm. So like students in History 370 are reading a biography, The Sword and the Shield, about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. But that book and some of the studies that focus on those iconic figures, while very important, we don't learn a lot about the many people behind the scenes who were part of the movements that they each represented, right? So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you thought about activism, maybe continue to expand on that point you made in your presentation.
Okay. When I think about the activism of women, I think about the activism that has not traditionally not been romanticized. That, like I said, we mentioned when we think about activism, we think about like march and sit-ins with the civil rights movement, the modern day civil rights movement, or the long lasting civil rights movement, depending on who your concept on that subject matter, or the Black Power movement with the men with the rifle and the black leather jacket and the beret. But like I say, activism is it starts from the ground up. It's activism is this idea of what can I do as a mother to improve my child's education? And it could be putting pressure on City Hall to desegregate white schools. It could be this idea of, well, I'm going to volunteer to be a tutor at my child's school. Or we can look at reform as these women did, that they want to implement policies to better the state of women, not only women, but people in the city, whether you're black, brown, white, or you're Asian. They want to improve. They want to make a better city, and they would take different avenues to get that across, to make that happen. So I'm trying. I hope I'm answering your question.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I mean, that whole concept of too, as motherhood is activism, right? I think is super critical.
Having this idea of where you want to make sure that garbage is picked up, that you don't want your community rat infested, and you don't want your child to be bitten by rats. You're lobbying, putting pressure on your representative, or you're going to City Hall screaming at the committee, demanding that you want improvement in these areas. That I'd also pay taxes. I'm relevant. I am a human being. I deserve the same privilege as individuals that may live on the north side of Chicago, or live on the Gold Coast of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
It's this idea about citizenship. It's this idea of being treated as a human being, and that's to me, that's the main thing. I mean, I think about like my mother. I mean, she was not administrating, here at Washington campaign, but my mom, she went out, got people to register to vote. She wore her hair Washington blue and white stripe button punch 9, I think, if I can remember. And she wore with pride, and she was determined to make a better community. That's what I think about this idea of activism. Mm-hmm. Am I?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's that's like such a rich answer in terms of thinking about how a reframing of activism can be made. I mean, that's actually something that like my colleague Sharon and I have been talking about with the Race and Anti-Racism Network that we've been helping to co-chair in some of our activities this year. It's just thinking about how activism happens, often behind the scenes in ways that are not recognized, in the sort of mainstream channels, often by white society, right? Mm-hmm. And if you think about the many people who are working behind the scenes, like I was so struck by especially the interview that you did with Jeanette Foreman, when she's talking about those committees that she has sitting on, and you just thinking about the amount of time and energy that would have been spent in attending those regular committee meetings and getting to the council hearings and keeping the pressure on first of all, to get the mayor elected, but then to keep the pressure on the mayor when they're in power, right? And as you said, like big cities like Chicago or big American cities, like lots of cities in other parts of the world, are ripe with really rigid power structures and hierarchies, and getting things to change takes a huge amount of effort, right? It's not just it's not a glamorous job, is what I guess I'm it doesn't sound glamorous to have to go to like these constant committee meetings and then council meetings and listening to, the Edward Doliaks, who are these really, backwards right-wing politicians who don't want to see change in their city. They want to keep the status quo, right? So, these women were in the trenches, duking it out, to get that kind of change and recognition, at the height of the 1980s, right, when a lot of the worst austerity also existed in that time in America, right? So
right, when you had the Reagan policy that cut social programs, it was cutting, public aid, which, by the way, most people that have public aid are white Americans, but people always think is the image of Black women. Reagan is, quote, the welfare queen. And he's talking about Black women, but if you look at the numbers, white people have white American citizens have welfare than African American. But it's this idea of racializing these certain programs, like, quote unquote, handout. I wanted to point out something that there were two things: the sword and the shield, and Councilor Foreman's interview. With regards to Councilor Foreman's interview, I think that's something that's very important that she articulated, and she pointed out how they brought in the young generation in to train them to be activists. And this was an ongoing thing that when I interviewed early in my interview, she told me how women taught her about activism. And these women were taught by older generation, particularly I.D.B. Wells. And that's why I said that's why I titled the daughter I.D.B. Wells, because these were the children of I.D.B. Wells. These women were the legacy of I.D.B. Wells, the activists that I.D.B. Wells implemented in Chicago. And she set the standard for activism for women, Black women in Chicago. So that's why I titled my dissertation, The Daughters of I.D.B. Wells. With regards to the book, when you look at Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the Honorable Malcolm X, it's this idea like, well, these are two different individuals with different mindset. No, they had the same mindset. They had the same agenda. And this is no different than the activism that I'm pointing out, that you have a Black nationalist organization movement who wants to battle black Chicagoans, and you had this racial correlation. They may have different views of identity, but they still came together. They had the same agenda. Movements are not monolithic. That leaderships do not think the same. They have different strategy, but it eventually will come around. It will come full circle. That's what I meant. And this is illustrated with the activism in Chicago.
You need to answer that.
Just terrible timing.
Well, we can take a little break maybe, and then we can come back. Continue.
Give me one moment, please.
No problem.
Oh.